Hey, howdy, hey. Sorry I'm late. I fell asleep. So, oh no, Billy Cox has been terminated with extreme prejudice. Let's see who all has been in here. I know Mrs. Metcalf was first. Hey, Freddie. Linda, Justin, Hefe, thanks for calling me. All right, let's get back into this one. Hey, Mrs. Metcalf. Um, yeah, I made that letters to Lucilius for her request to help people sleep. So hopefully it works. What's up, Logan? Holy cow. What's up, Groovy? All right, let's take the trigger warning down. Yeah, it worked on me recording it. That is for sure. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, no, Jeff called. All right. Grief is a combat injury. The fallen, the buddies, the sharers of foxholes, the tellers of stories, the dreamers without words, the singers without music, are fallen, are fallen. We clasp them once and for good, mightily, tearfully, each to our breast. Dan Levin, Marine Staff Sergeant, Iwo Jima, March 1945. I do appreciate it, Jeff. On a routine combat patrol outside Marja in January 2010, a squad of Marines from 2nd Platoon, Charlie 16, crept cautiously toward an adobe compound in a farm village, hunting a Taliban gang who were making and planning IEDs. The deadly bombs responsible for the majority of American dead and wounded. The Marines had just arrived in Afghanistan, and 3 squads, about 30 men in all, were assigned to a remote base called Outpost Husker. It would be a few weeks before Joey Shiano would raise his rocket launcher against the adobe wall of a farmer's compound not far away. Now, stepping warily at point at the head of the patrol was Lance Corporal Zachary Smitty Smith. He was 19 years old, taller than his dad, a New York State trooper, but with his dad's engaging grin. Growing up in small town Hornell, New York, he'd been deeply affected by the terror attacks of 9/11. When he was in the sixth grade, he glued an image of Osama bin Laden on a cardboard box and took pot shots at it with his grandfather's .22 rifle. Before he before he left Camp Lejeune with 1/6 that November, Smitty had gone home and married his high school sweetheart, Anne. Now he was barely a month into his first combat experience. As he stepped carefully, an IED suddenly erupted beneath him. Tearing off his legs and scything down other Marines with shrapnel and blast wounds. Corporal Zachary Auclair rushed to save him, kneeling and frantically pulling out tourniquets and bandages. Auclair was soon bathed in Smitty's blood. Watch for the second one. Watch for the second one. The Taliban often laid IED traps in pairs of bombs. And the senior leader on the patrol, 28-year-old platoon sergeant Daniel M. Angus, was frantically warning his Marines. And then he himself stepped on the second IED. The blast blew him apart, killing him instantly and spraying Auclair with blood and viscera. In the chaos, Staff Sergeant Warren Repshire, wounded in the face by shrapnel, was on the radio calling for a medevac bird, and Smitty lay dying in Auclair's arms. It is difficult to comprehend the emotional shock and grief that slammed into the Marines of Charlie 1-6. Of course, they realized that they were at war, and they knew, as they often said, that bad shit happens. Most of them had already done one deployment in Afghanistan, but that was a relatively benign tour in Garmsir, the trading post river town down south where I had deployed with the Marines. This was different. The Taliban would fight viciously to keep the Americans out of Marcia, and Charlie 1-6 knew that. Even though they'd been here barely a week, so the emotional shock didn't come from surprise as much as from catastrophic loss of deeply loved comrades, obliterated in an instant of horror, seared forever into the souls of the survivors. What lingers after the shock wears off is the deep moral injury of grief, perhaps the most common psychological wound of the generation that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. While Charlie 1-6 was attempting to absorb the loss of Smitty and Angus, the Army Surgeon General's Mental Health Advisory Team was arriving for its 7th survey of the emotional health of the troops, finding that just under 80% of combat soldiers and Marines had experienced a death in their unit. Just under, not just over. The pain that these men and women carry is not only the most common emotion, but perhaps the most difficult to share with outsiders. The survivors often feel guilt for having not spotted the IED that killed their buddy, or for surviving when their buddy goes home in a body bag. Many veterans find it impossible to convey the depth of emotion that binds members of a small unit like 2nd Platoon, and why each combat death thus cuts so deep. Coming together as they do, these emotions of grief, sorrow, shame, guilt, and loss endure as a powerful moral injury. Relationships that develop and deepen at war are different from those most civilians experience. By some mysterious process, the moral obligation hammered into green recruits. You're responsible for your buddy, no matter what, grows into a lovingly and steely devotion that leads military people, and especially those in ground combat, to value the lives and well being of their comrades more deeply than their own. Friendships are shorn out of pretense and affectation by shared hardship and the forced intimacies of communal living under stress. It's difficult to act aloof and superior when everyone in your squad is bathed in the sweat and filth of weeks without a shower and has been defecating in holes in the ground or in bags of kitty litter. There are no secrets out there. The strengths and weaknesses of every man and woman are magnified and exposed. It is life lived vividly. The narcotic of this web of relationships is why wounded grunts medevac to distant surgical wards and swathed in bandages and tubes will struggle to get back to their guys. It is why the returning combat troops may find old relationships with spouses and friends to be flat and dull. It is when their tour of duty is complete, they're back in civilian life. The separation from their buddies produces the empty ache of loss. The shared intimacies and shared risks are experiences that separate them forever from those who weren't there. The camaraderie in war is dangerous. As in any loving relationship, death can be devastating to the survivor. Soldiers and Marines at war are used to seeing dead bodies, even those of other Americans. But you can't distance yourself from the mangled face of a dead loved one. Psychologist Iona Pivar once studied the prevalence of grief among Vietnam War combat veterans. What she found was stunning. Many of them had lost beloved buddies in combat. Their grief, more than 30 years later, was deeper and more painful than their sorrow at the recent loss of their spouse. In the bloody chaos of the awful day in Afghanistan, Angus was dead, Smitty was dying, and his best friend, Xavier Zell, knew he should go over and grip Smitty's hand to give him some comfort in his last moments. But Smitty was a bloody mess, and Zell, 22, told himself he had to pull security, taking his place in the outward-facing defense perimeter the Marines had set up. Anticipating an attack and waiting frantically for the medevac chopper to come in, Zell was torn, knowing he should go to his friend, but he was afraid it was too much. He couldn't even look. The helicopter and Smitty and Angus were zipped in the body. The helicopter came, and Smitty and Angus were zipped into body bags and put on stretchers and carried out to the landing zone and loaded on board. And away they went. Darren Doss watched them go. Afterward, he thought, we just got here and this already happened. How the fuck are we going to make it out of here? In some ways, Doss seemed the most fragile of Charlie 1-6. He depended heavily on his buddies for support, yet he could appear untethered, so that events would lift him to giddy heights and drop him back into black despair. He laughed the loudest and sorrowed more deeply than the others. That Christmas of 2009, he told me, I woke up early and Lance, Corporal Justin Shreve, was on fire watch. And he was like, hey, man, he puts his arm around my shoulder and he's like, Merry Christmas, Doss. Like, Merry Christmas, Shreve. And he just like slips me two little shooter bottles of vodka. Remembering Doss blinked away tears. It was just, yeah. Doss told me this story years later when he and Nick Rudolph and Stephen Canty and I met to talk one long afternoon in a Philadelphia hotel room. They'd gone out for smokes and more beer, and they'd settled back in and took up the story. The day that Smitty and Angus were killed was bad. Doss had just come back from a patrol and his squad with his squad. No doubt. No doubt, Jeff. Mouthwash bottles and them. From a distance, he heard the blast and seen the column of smoke, and he knew, in telling the story now, Doss spoke mechanically, his words dead. I saw the gunny and first sergeant zip them up in the body bags. Angus, both his legs were gone, and one arm was gone, and the other was kind of fused in an awkward position. They put the bags on stretchers, then went out to the helo single file. And the helo took them away, and I went back to my tent, and Eau Claire was sitting there, and there were like guts hanging off his helmet all over his stuff. He was crying, and he had baby wipes, but the baby wipes were all dried up, covered with blood. He was trying to clean under his fingernails, and I sat down and I wanted to talk with him and maybe try to cheer him up, but I didn't know what to say. I like gave him a pack of baby wipes I'd gotten in the mail, and I went outside and just that was about it. The next three Marine squads occupying the combat outpost held a memorial for Smitty and Angus. Eau Claire had taken off his stained cloth helmet cover and never wore it again. He and the others stood respectfully. The chaplain came and pulled us together and like gave us this speech, Doss remembered. And it was basically, he said, like, this shit, happens, and he didn't really help much. Everyone was kind of like, yeah, he meant well, but everybody was talking or walking around with tears in their eyes the whole day. We had to go out the next day. We had the memorial, and later that day, we went out on patrol, and we got ambushed. It is no joke, Groovy, and therapy takes, it's a hard work and takes a lot out of you. We were in the open desert, Doss said, and you could hear rounds bouncing off the rocks, and no one could take cover because we were like just flat open. Finally, they were able to fire back with rockets and grenade launchers. We hit this Taliban dude and fucked him up. And another guy was dragging him behind a wall. And he was fucking throwing up after he dragged the dude. And then we leveled the place. We went insane, and Gunny was yelling, "That's enough, that's enough." The room was silent for a moment. What happened next? I asked. Doss, we walked back in and I had an MRE. The room exploded with laughter. I mean, that's about as a matter of fact as you can get, really. Laughter, in fact, is the mental health therapy that combat Marines and soldiers use to survive. The explosive release of laughter can keep grief at bay, at least for a while. If we really get down and think about what we did, Canty said once, it's a slippery slope. Avoidance is a great strategy. As the story of Smitty and Angus was still reverberating, someone started telling the one about the tent stakes adjacent to the Marines' outpost was an encampment of Afghan National Army soldiers who lived in the U.S. military tent that was pegged to the desert floor with huge wooden stakes. Across the way, the Marines would build a fire at night, and since wood was scarce, they began eyeing those tent stakes. Doss. Every night we'd go over to the NA tent and sneak off with a couple of their stakes and use them for fire. But we're careful to take only one or two at a time. One night, a transport helo came in and with water resupply, landing in a hurricane blast of dirt and pebbles, and the Marines took cover. When we went out there to get water, Doss said, we look across the dirt and like the Afghan army tent is 100% gone. All their cots are sitting in a row, but the tent itself is gone because we had burned every one of their stakes. We're all helpless with laughter at this. They had no idea what happened, Doss said, recovering and wiping tears from his eyes. They were standing around like baffled. Then there was the Christmas tree caper at their base in Marcia. The Marines had stacked their empty Connex boxes 3 high, and that December, the battalion chaplain had a couple of Marines erect a decorated Christmas tree on the top. One day, one of the platoon sergeants said to Charlie 16 Marines, hey, I got a mission for you guys. See that Christmas tree? After chow, I want that Christmas tree in our tent. Get the Christmas spirit. So that night, said Doss, we dress in all black, fucking climb up there and cut the rope securing it. And we make it down to like the first Connex box, and all of a sudden, hey, what are you doing? No matter how many times the Marines have told and retold this story, they are laughing and shouting over one another, trying to tell it again. Nick Rudolph takes over. We get caught, and we're up there, and some of the guys took it out there, and we're like, fuck. And the chaplain comes, and he's like, I want your fucking name and rank, who you're with. And I'm like, I'm second platoon. And he goes, what's your name? And I'm like, I'm Rudolph, sir. And the chaplain is beat red with rage, bellowing up at Rudolph. And he's like, you're trying to tell me your name is Rudolph and you're stealing my Christmas tree on Christmas? I don't fucking believe it. They put the tree back up, but hopped down off of the other side of the Connex boxes and escaped punishment. But, oh man, Rudolph said, chuckling and shaking his head. Stole my shirt there, guy. Oh, man. Capers were always fun. Around that time, there was an Afghan kid who used to come around the Marines' outpost, basking in their attention. One day, he kept trying to get them to go outside, wanting to show them something. Who Doss and Canty and some others finally went with him into an adjacent field towards a tree line and discovered a desiccated corpse. Can't you see my nose? Do you see what I see? The man the Marines had shot a while back. Canty remembered the shooting. The man had been acting suspiciously and wouldn't respond to the warning shots the Marines had fired in accordance with the row, and so he was shot and killed. Now his body had been ravaged by dogs. Turned out that the corpse was the boy's father, who was deaf and mute and couldn't hear or respond to warning shots, the boy explained. And that's why he appeared to ignore the Marines and why he was shot and killed and was now lying dead in a field. Damn. Not sure how that feels, Canty said, when I asked him how he'd reacted to that awful news. Here we are trying to do our American ideals all over the place, and we're being arrogant cowboys. In the accumulation of such events, he said, the morality did wear down. But Doss took it harder. That killing and the realization of how it had taken place created a grief that seemed to penetrate deep into his soul. Few knew it at the time, but his own father was in poor health, in and out of the hospital, with an autoimmune condition, among other problems. And he'd had surgery on a pacemaker implanted in his chest. He'd been sick since Doss was in the 6th grade. He would joke to Darren and his 2 sisters that his pacemaker sometimes would shock the shit out of me. And the kids would laugh, but they realized that meant his heart was stopping. Michael Doss died in 2012, 2 years after Darren came home from Afghanistan. Spider Dog. After his father's funeral and burial in Niskauna Reformed Church just outside of Schenectady, New York, Darren began to have nightmares, exploding awake in horror. He spoke about it in the videotaped interviews that Stephen Canty has done with members of Charlie 1-6. And we watched the interview with Doss one afternoon as a dozen Marines and I were sprawled across hotel room beds. Doss had gone home earlier. In the video, Doss is saying that in his nightmares, he is back in Afghanistan, going out into that field with Canty and the Afghan boy, and they find the corpse. But instead of the Afghan man who'd been dead for days, it's his father, and his father's face is partially eaten away. And on the videotape, Doss is breaking down and gulping sobs of anguish, but he manages to finish eaten away by dogs, and he ducks down out of the camera's view, and the sounds of sobbing fade slowly. In our hotel room, there's dead silence for long moments. Then somebody says, "I love you, Doss." All right, that's about all I can take today of this one. Uh, we're precisely 50% done with this book, so we should finish it this week. Hey, Mrs. Metcalf, that is hey Top. That is also Northern Ned. Spider Dogs is the eight legs of the Mossad in Canada. So chat menace too. Oh yes, yes indeed. Okay. Are we doing anything tonight, Hefe? All right. 7:45 at Hill Pirate Studios. And I will well, I mean slacking or falling asleep when your show's supposed to be on. Blah 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 blah. You know. Either way. Um just don't play copyrighted music on your show, huh? Five inches of snow. All right, you guys. I will see y'all at 7:45. We'll get this one finished up this week, by the way. Well, at least you got puppy sitters, Jeff.